it's pretty interesting to me in that this seems to be one of those things that is simultaneously easy to define and also can be quite hard.
Mm,
And there are certain things that stick out in the genre that are very obvious stylistic choices and tropes. And then there are other movies that seem to be kind of on the fringes of Giallo,
mm,
but not really sticking to that formula.
mm.
This book, So Deadly, So Perverse by Troy Howarth. I'll try and see if you can.
I can see a bit of the
It's
cover.
phasing in and out because I have this background. I've been having this issue with my Zoom meetings, but it's been an amazing resource.
Mm,
I learned a lot from that, and in particular, kind of how the whole thing began and how it's very much inspired by and named after the sort of pulp novels that were being published in Italy in the
mm.
in the
I
late 30s and
remember.
40s.
Yeah, I remember it's because the pages are yellow or something like
The
that.
the covers, all the covers are
Yes.
yellow. Yeah, so giallo for anyone who doesn't know is the Italian term for the color yellow. And this whole genre of crime novels were called that because of their yellow covers, primarily published by a company called Mondadori. And these novels, not unlike I would say film noir, are kind of the inspiration and influence of how these films start getting made. Very popular at the time. There's this interesting thing where Italy is in a very immediate post World War II, post Mussolini era, and all of these filmmakers are kind of able to start creating more freely. I found
Mm.
this with my last episode that I just did actually because I've done a spaghetti westerns back to back with Giallo.
Mm.
So I've watched like 30 something Italian movies within the
Yeah.
last month or so, and all of them are kind of they're in conversation with each other a lot, I think. There are a lot of the same actors who are doing both, dipping their toes into both. A lot of the same writers and directors. So that's just been a kind of fun, really interesting experiment for me.
I've always found like I'm taking away from Giallo just for a moment, just for a moment.
Hmm.
When I was doing my BA at university, I did a dissertation on the consequences of war in post-war Japanese cinema. One of the things I'd found out, and I suppose it would apply to Giallo too, is whenever there was a war that placed a lot of restriction or censorship on the arts, afterwards you had filmmakers who were definitely trying to push the limits of what was acceptable.
Hmm.
And as you've mentioned, I feel like with Giallo, it's sort of like the younger cousin of film noir in being able to push more violence or more sex, or I suppose when it becomes a bit more surreal, more occultist imagery and stuff like that.
Hmm.
I don't know. I just think it. There must be something very liberating in these sort of subgenres to be able to find areas that you can push people's buttons a bit more, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true. I've found that as well. The book especially kind of goes into more of what a lot of these directors and writers were pulling from as far as even American influence and British influence,
Mm,
and a lot of them were very inspired by Fritz Lang,
mm,
Alfred Hitchcock. You know, you can see their style kind of in the DNA of all of this stuff, I think. Stylistically, I think the tropes of this genre are very recognizable, right? We have the black gloved killer, I think is probably the most famous and easily
mm.
recognizable element of all of this stuff. The victims primarily always being women.
Yeah.
Also popular in film noir, also popular in spaghetti westerns. This was a rough time all around. Yeah, the leaning into more lurid areas of storytelling, of exposing sexuality and um, the I think the excess of this stuff feeds on that as well, and also kind
Mm,
of influences the next big generation of American filmmakers, especially horror filmmakers.
yes,
Um, it really surprised me actually when I was watching a lot of these films, how many of them are a bit more subtle and tame than I had
mm,
expected, and how many of them are kind of actually subtle comedies,
mm.
as well
I
as
sort of found that with the girl who knew too much,
hmm
which feels so much more restrained by today's standards. But when you're comparing it to like even later Giallo films or later Mario Bava films, there's like it it really kind of holds back on a lot of things, and it
yes.
tries to focus more on misdirection or the angle I quite liked that it took was it presents this sort of anxiety a lot of women have of not being taken seriously
Oh,
when
yes.
they've got their concerns about I don't know if they've witnessed something traumatizing or whatever. A lot of I'm sure a lot of women can relate where they feel like they've been dismissed or oh it's delusional or it's just stress, and it's like it really tapped into that perspective that I don't see. I've been seeing it more in recent films, but this
hmm
is like 50 plus years ago.
Yeah. I found that in a few of the actually even in a few of the later films that I tried to cover. The book here, it only there's two volumes actually. The first volume only
Mm,
covers the first 10 years, but I would say that 10 years is the artistic explosion of what this stuff is. It's when all of the films that are most widely regarded and recognized are happening and coming out. Everything after sort of feels like either a reflection of that time period or like someone trying to reinvent themselves or push the envelope or do something
mm,
new with the form. But I think this 10-year period of like 63 to 73 is really the crucial time. And then there are a few kind of right after that that I think are very important that we'll go through as well
mm,
towards the end. But there's also this element of very surreal and dreamlike imagery in these movies that I think
mm.
is so influential in so much of kind of our modern day cinema, especially when you look at the sort of serial killer slasher genre, I think is
Yeah,
really born out of this.
yeah,
And a lot of those movies utilize that kind of imagery. People like Jodorowsky and David Lynch and all of these other very well regarded cult directors utilize that kind of imagery. But I hadn't seen it in quite this way. I mean, so my own kind of brief history with this sort of subgenre is that I discovered Suspiria maybe 5 or 6 years ago,
yeah,
and that seems to be a lot of people's entry point, I think,
yeah. It was
for
mine.
it. Yeah, and seeing that movie and seeing what he was able to put on screen, it was one of those moments in time where you're like, I've never seen anything like this before.
Mm,
And it was very profound, and that sent me looking for other Argento movies. And then as I was putting together the kind of things that I wanted to cover on the show, I started thinking, I bet there's a lot of these movies that I've never seen or never heard of, and
yeah.
it turns out there it's like far too much. Once again, as with my spaghetti western episode, I think I bit off more than I could chew,
Mm.
and did not quite get to all the films that I really wanted to. A lot of them are also
Did you see the Great Silence?
no, I didn't,
Oh,
and that was a major one that I intended. In fact, my guest on that episode, Jared, he said we should come on his podcast and talk about the Great Silence because he watched it and he thought it was quite great.
yeah.
And but I did see a lot of those films that were blind spots for a long time and really blew me away. I think the craft of both the directors that were doing those things and these guys
Mm.
is really kind of unparalleled for this time period. Just and we'll talk about kind of each director's different sort of stylistic choices, but I think especially Mario Bava, the way he photographs things and what he's
Mm.
able to capture in a frame is just remarkable to me. I mean, I have this kind of set up in my little virtual backdrop here.
Yeah.
Just his colors and his sense of um,
Especially Blood and Black Lace.
yes, yes, the
Yeah.
painterly aesthetic that feels like it feels like a fever dream to me, I
And
think.
one of the things that surprised me with that film, I know like Suspiria and other Argento films are really colourful and vibrant, but Blood and on Black Lace is before Suspiria, and
Hmm.
he manages the scenery manages to be lit with like such vibrant colors without ever sacrificing the sense of it being an intimidating, dark, dank sort of space, you know.
Yes.
Um, as you said with mentioning Fritz Lang earlier, you have these really oppressive shadows that you feel like you'd think would come straight from German Expressionism. These like dark angles that sort of populate these wide open spaces, just kind of dotted with the right color here and there to
Hmm.
kind of. I sort of noticed it the most with there's a scene towards the end, and there's all these mannequin dolls sort of lit in different colors in this very large, spacious hall, and you don't really see much else in the room. It's
Hmm.
all dark except of these pops of color, and it's just I don't know how to describe it other than it's just spectacular, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's one thing that I found a little tough with even trying to find a through line for a lot of these movies is that you're just sort of in awe of the pure image making itself. And there are certain ones that I think narratively are quite strong as well, but I think overall the main draw to this entire genre is the aesthetic, right?
Mm,
Um, and a lot of them were inspired by older German films, the German creamy crime films of the 30s and 40s, inspired by film noir. I think, as I kind of briefly mentioned, I think this sort of sets up the phenomenon that becomes the slasher movie, especially in America. I've heard John Carpenter talk about Dario Argento's influence on his work. Toby Hooper, obviously, with the Texas
mm.
Chainsaw Massacre. Sean S. Cunningham with Friday the 13th. I mean, he blatantly just kind of rips off a kill scene note for note
Mm,
from A Bay of Blood for Friday the 13th, which we'll talk about briefly. And then and De Palma too, I think,
yeah.
is an important one to note because he's always kind of been compared to Hitchcock in his execution, but also I think if you look at like Dress to Kill,
Mm.
very, very, very Giallo
And
inspired.
even thinking like Blowout, you have these like really elaborate composite shots that are almost like collages, and
Hmm.
it's almost like this feels like something they would have done in Giallo as well. Like you have things in the foreground and the background and the
Hmm.
center ground, and then there's no wasted space in any of the frame, you know. I sort of think about again Blood on Black Lace. There's this shot with the black handbag as its owner goes on to do a fashion show, and our attention, like we see the show in the background, we see the bag in the foreground, we're sort of expecting someone to take it, and it's just there's no wasted space whatsoever.
Yes.
I you kind of think that that sort of efficient use of framing I do. I could see the connection to De Palma. I'd be surprised if he said he had never seen a Giallo film before.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And if he did, we'd almost certainly know he'd be lying.
Hmm.
That I think, along with it's interesting that in recent years there's been kind of an explosion in this, not only in the popularity of the original movement of, I think a lot of people are just now discovering these films thanks to things like Mubi and the Criterion Collection and
Mm.
um,
Arrow are
Shudder
very
and
good.
Arrow Video. Yeah, I
Mm.
mean, I for most of the ones that I watched, I tried to get as many physical copies as I could from
Mm.
my local library, and stunningly enough, they had all four volumes of Arrow Video's Giallo collection. So I watched
Nice.
a lot of those films that way, and they've been beautifully restored. They've been
Mm.
rescanned at 2K and 4K, and are often presented in Italian as well as English
Mm.
dub. So again, as the an important thing to note, I think, for the audience is that while all of these films are sort of based in or around Italy. They are co-productions with Italy, Spain, Germany, France. So all of our cast and crew are speaking different languages, and
Yes.
therefore there's no actual real recorded dialogue on the set. So
Mm.
all of these films, just as in the spaghetti western films, are overdubbed. I actually found it some of the some of the things that I had to find like on Tubi or something
Mm.
that weren't available anywhere else. You get this kind of mixture of Italian and English, and
Oh, that's
often
strange.
in the same
Yeah.
film, just because of how how the dubbing worked out, and
That's
um,
like the version of what's it called? Four Flies on Grey Velvet. The
hmm
version I watched of that, it for some reason it chops between Italian and English halfway through. I
hmm
imagine it's maybe just not a great distribution job.
Yes, well, so I the same thing happened with the version of Deep Red that I watched, which I do have the physical copy of, thankfully. But according to what I tried to find on that, it's that there was like a theatrical cut that was released entirely in an English dub, and then when it
Mm.
was restored, they put back in some scenes that had been cut. And those scenes had only been dubbed in Italian previously. I found it quite difficult watching that movie, as wonderful and masterful as that movie is. I think it's one of my favorites on this list now. But it was kind of a whiplash where it would bounce back and forth. And having the subtitles on the entire time, you don't really notice that someone else is speaking a new language. I mean, it would often change mid-scene. That's how kind of jarring it was. But yeah, this has become a very popular movement as of late. I think a lot of modern filmmakers are trying to do their own thing in this
Mm.
style. There was a kind of proper Giallo a few years ago called The Strange Color of Your Body's Tears.
Don't know that one.
It's very interesting. It's directed by a duo called Catet and Forzani, I believe, if I remember right.
Oh, I've seen the poster. I've never seen the
Yes,
film
great
though.
poster. They
Mm.
also made this kind of acid western called Let the Corpses Tan, which was a very interesting
Ooh,
film.
what a name.
Yeah, great title. We at some point we've got to talk about the title conventions of this genre too, because they are just
Yeah.
fantastic. So there was that, and then I think some other modern examples could be like the Neon Demon from Nicholas Winding Refn.
Yeah, I was also thinking Gaspar Noé because
Mm,
I mean, ignoring the fact that he has Dario Argento starring in Vortex,
right.
so many of his like most transgressive works, it's just full of color. There's a lot of death, or there's a lot of sex, or there's a lot of drugs, the sort of things we'd expect from Giallo.
hmm
Except I think he takes it. He's intending to take it to such excessive heights, isn't he?
hmm
Um, whoever kills someone in like irreversible, we know the identity of the ones committing the violence, and he then whisks us away elsewhere, and the mystery is more in where is it taking us.
Right, yes. And that is the kind of crux of a lot of these films, I think, is
Mm,
while while the story construction itself seems pretty simple on the surface, I think the directions that they go and kind of how these plots can get very easily convoluted over the course
mm,
of the film is one of the most fun parts about watching it, I think, and can
yeah.
also be one of the most frustrating parts,
Yes.
especially for new viewers and people trying to figure out what this thing is.
I was thinking, yes, when you're saying about frustration and how convoluted it is, you notice quite quickly that there's good convoluted in Giallo, and then
hmm
there's not the great,
Yes, yes.
I sort of felt that when I was watching Four Flies on Grey Velvet, when I don't want to spoil it, but there's a certain scene towards the end where the killer's identity is revealed, as we kind of expect with the genre at some
hmm
point. And there's this vast amount of exposition they're dumping on us, and it's like I just could not care.
Yeah, yeah. I found that as well. I think this is
Mm,
one of those sort of filmic movements that has very high highs and fairly
mm,
low lows as well. But and then there's also a lot of middle ground. to.
Mm.
So I tried to make a sort of comprehensive list for us to kind of follow here.
Yes.
Obviously, that it's not entirely full because there are far too many films to attempt to cover, especially in one
Yes.
episode. I think starting in 1963 with The Girl Who Knew Too Much
Yes.
is probably I think it seems to be the most widely recognized kind of real starting point for the genre. I think Mario Bava at the time is very well regarded, and his capacity for just purely visual storytelling. So sadly, I did not get to catch this movie. It was according to Letterboxd, it was available on Shudder and Tubi, but I looked for it on both services and it did not come up.
It
So,
it might depend on your region,
yeah,
mightn't it?
exactly.
I
Yeah.
get on Letterboxd, it tells me, oh, it's available on Shudder, and it's not. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes it has a bias over one region over another, I guess.
Yes. But I think yeah, this one it incorporates the aesthetics and the tropes of those novels that were so popular at the time and kind of establishes this loose but also fairly tight blueprint of kind of what these films are and what they'll become, and it is really like a jumping off point for Bava's not only Bava's next movie, but Argento and Martino and all these other directors that we'll talk
Mm,
about to kind of expound upon. 64 is Blood and Black Lace from Mario Bava again. If The Girl Who Knew Too Much is kind of the toes dipping in the water, I think this is the real like fully diving in.
yes.
It's set in a high-end fashion house. A model is murdered and her diary goes missing. This diary contains secrets involving her friends and coworkers who could all be likely suspects in a series of continuing brutal murders. Yeah, this knocked me out. I was really stunned by just visually what it was doing.
Yeah.
I think a fashion house is kind of the perfect setting for this kind of story, you
Yeah,
know?
as I've been watching more Giallo for this podcast, one of the things that I think about this genre is how fashionable even like the lesser entries can be. So as you say,
Hmm.
a fashion house setting just makes sense, doesn't it? You get all these wonderful costumes or like
Oh, they're exquisite.
yeah, or like the hair and makeup, or it's all fashionable and glamorous. And when it comes to the violence, it's like the violence is glamorous too, in like
Yes.
this absurd way. It's like everyone's death just looks beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. Which I think is what I think that's kind of what sets Mario Bava apart from the rest of these directors is his capacity for being able to do that, to show you
Mm,
this gorgeously orchestrated violence. I think the theme of the destruction of beauty in this movie, the way that the killer murders the women in such brutal ways as to kind of intentionally mar their faces or destroy their beauty in some
mm,
way. Just truly disturbing. 1965. So this film, The Possess from Bazzoni and Rossellini, I watched, I guess I would say the majority of it last night.
mm,
So I'm not exactly sure why this movie is necessarily included in a lot of the research that I went through because to me it's just really not indicative of a Giallo movie. For one thing, it's in black and white, which I feel like the colors are one of the things that really makes a true Giallo.
mm,
It has a heavy use of voiceover narration, which to me just kind of
mm,
signaled more of a noir feeling. It looks like a noir. Some of the editing and stylistic choices are actually very French New Wave. It to me just is really an outlier, but I wanted to include it here because it is most often regarded as part of the genre.
that's not one I managed to get a chance to watch.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I just don't think it really falls into the category that we're trying to sort of put together here. And then, very briefly, in 1968, there's this baffling movie called Death Laid an Egg from Giulio Questi, and it's just a very bizarre experimental movie. The first third of it, I was just trying to follow anything. It's just it's borderline impossible to really to really follow narratively. I think it's more of a sensory experience, and it is an interesting one at that, but ultimately I think kind of non-essential to the films that we covered. But next is 1970 with The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which
Yes.
is truly one of the lodestar entries here, I think. This is Dario
Mm.
Argento's first movie, and it's about an American writer who's on vacation in Rome when he witnesses an attempted murder in an art gallery. And although he's due to leave the next day, the police believe that he saw what really happened. So he is forced to stay and help them solve the mystery. This one, Argento comes just like fully formed with such an
Mm.
artistic voice with this movie, I feel like. And I'm sure it's in no small part thanks to his previous work as a film critic and as a story writer. Famously has a story credit on Once Upon a Time in the West from Sergio
Yeah.
Leone. And so he was around these filmmakers and he was working with them on lots of different things. And when he steps out on his own, it's just with immediate style. I had seen this once before, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Remember really liking it a lot, and then I went ahead and purchased the Blu-ray to rewatch it. Yeah, it's one of my favorites. I think it has one of the more interesting twists at the end,
Yes, definitely.
wherein you see what actually was occurring at the inciting incident. Yeah, again, it's just his stylistic choices here really kind of revolutionizes the genre as a whole. It feels like if, you know, 6 years ago, Blood and Black Lace gives birth to the movement, this kind of feels like a very quick rebirth,
Yeah.
I think.
It's a really confident debut, and yet I'd also say you find that he develops his voice even further as
Hmm.
in his later films. Like I feel like Bird with the Crystal Plumage is it's not got the same vibrancy in terms of lighting or color or costumes. Um, there's a sense of humor to it
Yes.
that you don't quite get in the same sense as his later films. Or not to say there isn't any humor in his later films, but here it's like it's finding there's like a near romantic subplot, and am I getting it right?
Hmm.
There
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
he's with his girlfriend and they're planning to go away and now they have to stay and yeah, the sense of humor, especially I mean with the sort of mad painter character that we meet about
Mm,
halfway through the film who
yes,
eats cats.
yeah.
You know, there's an element of the bizarre I think to this movie
Mm,
that you don't really find as much in some of the previous entries.
definitely.
And but this is one that kind of becomes very commercially popular as well as artistically popular. I think it's a huge hit in Italy and abroad. I mean, just the team working on this thing too. It's shot by Vittorio Storaro, legendary Italian cinematographer, scored by Ennio Morricone, of course,
Mm,
who ends up working on a lot of these movies. A lot of the scores he does here in this time period I hadn't heard before, so that was a really cool experience
mm,
hearing some of those for the first time. But that is a major kind of resetting sort of mic drop moment, I think,
yeah.
for Argento, for everyone else to kind of pick up the mantle. 1970, yeah, I had a film called Death Occurred Last Night. Did not get to it, but it's highly recommended. And then $5 for an August Moon the same year. This is another Bava movie. He took this job as kind of a strict for hire job, I think because he just needed some money. He did not like the script for this movie, so he ended up changing a lot of things. It's about a wealthy man who invites a group of friends to his private island. This is a cover for a shady attempt to steal away the rights to an invention created by one of the guests, who are all being murdered one by one. So this movie is just Glass Onion, but but in Italy in the 70s. As I was watching it, that's all I could really think about.
Mm,
The murders are more brutal, but it's also kind of tame and a little laid back. I mean, it's set on an island, so there's kind of this natural laid back feeling to it, I think.
mm,
Lots of just long sort of roaming shots of the people relaxing on the beach, and most of the killings are actually off screen. You don't really even see much of the violence in this one, but it is still gorgeous to look at. And I think it's a showcase for Edwige Fenech, who becomes like a major figure in this entire movement. She's in so many of these movies. And this kind of like really introduces her, I think.
This wasn't one I managed to get around to seeing myself.
Yeah, I think it's worth watching just for um, kind of the stylistic differences and the choices that it makes, sort of that contradict most of what Bava usually does. But ultimately, it wasn't one of my favorites. Um, and then a film that I really wanted to see but did not get to was The Forbidden Photos of a Lady Above Suspicion. Have you
Mm.
ever seen that?
No, that's a great title though.
Yeah, it's an amazing title. I mean,
It,
so many of these titles are just. I was thinking about like, why don't movies get called things like this
yeah,
anymore? You know?
like quite elaborate.
Yes,
It
they're elaborate and they're so poetic and
it's the above suspicion reminds me of Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion.
yes,
Not a Giallo film, but
right.
Italian and a
Hmm.
thriller, a dark comedy, and everything. I have a soft spot for these very elaborate, evocative titles.
I do too. Yeah, and suspicion is one that's used quite often too. There's
Mm,
later there's The Suspicious Death of a Minor,
mm,
which I watched. And I think there may be one other that I may not have included on here, but yeah, fantastic naming conventions for these things. I mean, something like The Killer Reserved 9 seats or The
yeah,
Red Queen Kills 7 times. Like it's so evocative
yeah.
and so matter of
It's visual,
fact.
yeah, visual, and the best ones don't feel clunky either.
Hmm. Yes.
There's a skill in it, isn't there?
So 1971, A Bay of Blood. We both watched this one. This is another
Yes.
Mario Bava film. Quite liked it. It's about when a wealthy heiress is killed, a murder spree ensues as relatives and friends attempt to seize her fortune. This is complicated by some local teenagers who are camping out in a sort of derelict building on the estate. This to me is definitely the most kind of proto slasher,
Yes.
is especially in the way that the kills are executed
Mm.
and the staging of kind of what you see and what you don't see and the excess of the carnage and the gore. So many
Yeah.
very good makeup effects in this movie, I think.
Mm. One of the things that caught me off guard was the first 5 minutes.
Yes.
When you've seen enough Giallo films, you expect there to be a killer, but you don't expect the killer to be killed at the
Yes.
beginning.
Yeah. Yeah,
It
when
was,
he's when it's immediately revealed, I thought, "Wow, what an interesting
yeah.
choice." And then he's killed by someone else, and I thought, "Yeah,
Mm,
that's it's very inventive." I think, Bava, much like Argento, it seems like he's kind of trying to outdo himself every time. I
yes.
think he's just he seems interested in trying to and always trying to capture something new
Mm,
while still working in his kind of preferred mode of what he wants to show you. In the Howarth book that I reference a lot in this conversation, this movie is called Twitch of the Death Nerve, another amazing title.
yeah. Where was it released with that title?
I don't know, but it's but that's kind of the main one that he refers to it as, and Bay of Blood is actually one of the secondary titles. So I
It's
don't know
like
if it was.
because I saw when I watched the Girl Who Knew Too Much, it seems to be titled as The Evil Eye in some areas as
Hmm.
well,
Hmm.
and I have no idea why because there's not really anything to do specifically with an eye or
Yeah,
it's just
yeah. I know
there's
that. So just from what I could read up on, I know that many of these films when they weren't released in America at the same time as they were in Italy, sometimes they would
mm,
get there, they would come to America a year or two later. And just knowing kind of how Hollywood tended to work at the time and what they were trying to do as far as sell a movie, I think they retitled a lot of these films in order to sort of maybe make them more commercially viable.
mm,
Because yeah, I think if you put out a movie in America called The Iguana with the Tongue of Fire, you're gonna have to explain that to some people,
yes,
to some folks, and and Hollywood definitely seems like they would get imported movies and probably say, yeah, we should shorten this to like 2 words
Yeah.
that don't actually have anything to do with the plot of the movie, but maybe like a buzzy title that they could think up. So then 1971, I think, is like just an unbelievable year as far as the output
Mm,
of 71 and 72 both. I think as far as the output of just the number of these films, and this feels to me like the 2 years that are probably most important as far as the films that were put out. Many of these I've unfortunately didn't get to see. Cat o' Nine
yeah.
Tails from Dario Argento, which is his second film, and then Four Flies on Grey Velvet. I didn't get to see, but you did.
Yeah, I just want to add because all I've mentioned before, it's not my favorite Argento, and it becomes convoluted in a way that I found quite frustrating.
Hmm.
But other than that, it's a really stylish film. Like, I mean, when I've been watching some of the other Giallo titles, I feel like Argento seems to have he's a real stylist at heart, even when the other films from his contemporaries are very stylish too. He feels like in some alternate universe he'd be directing perfume adverts and stuff. They're just very
Hmm.
fashionable looking films.
Hmm.
And Four Flies on Grey Velvet, he has these very elaborate slow motion shots sometimes. Like there's one shot where we see a bullet enter someone through the shoulder, and I gasped because I was like,
Mm.
how on earth?
Yeah.
That time period,
Hmm.
there's some shots like the inside of a guitar at the beginning, pointing out through the strings as they're being strummed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's some really elaborate imagery for a story that really kind of doesn't deserve it.
Hmm.
Because I couldn't care for any of these characters. The mystery
Hmm.
wasn't that intriguing, but God, it looks gorgeous.
Yeah.
There's a hallucinatory dream sequence with that's about an execution that one of the characters has overheard. And then the final minute or so, I'm hoping it's not a spoiler giving this away, but there's a car crash and it looks just gorgeous. It's
Mm.
like very slowed down, slow motion,
Hmm.
where the windshield cracking looks like snowflakes.
Oh, wow.
It's
Mm.
great. Worth watching just for the visuals alone, quite honestly.
Yeah, you can tell at this time he's really kind of stretching his legs and figuring out lots of different camera techniques to use. I mean,
Mm,
that shot in Bird with the crystal plumage that comes out of the camera, kind of comes out of the woman's mouth,
mm,
is fascinating. Like how do you get that in
mm,
1970?
yeah.
Yeah. So there's that. The Fifth Chord, also a fairly well-known Giallo starring Franco Nero, actually, that was on one of the Arrow editions that I got, but I did not get to see that one as well either. And then we have The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, which I watched last night. This was the final movie in the stretch that I watched, which I really enjoyed. I thought it was really
Mm,
great. This is from Sergio Martino. It's about a socialite, Julie Ward, who begins receiving blackmail letters attributed to a mysterious killer who she suspects is her cruel former lover, Jean. As her husband is frequently out of town, Julie falls into the arms of a friend, George, as the unknown assassin begins making bloody moves towards her. This film kind of starts as a what you think is going to be a sort of very simple police procedural, and then it becomes very much about sadomasochism and
mm,
sexual expression and paranoia. I think Edwig Finnick's performance in this movie is incredible. She's fully inhabiting this woman who is just scared to death of her surroundings, of her previous relationship with this guy who practically tortured her, even though she was still sort of complicit in the relationship. She is fearful of him, and she's also surrounded by these two other men, neither of whom seem to trust her, but also want to control her every move. And I think she's just doing some really interesting stuff as far as like just trying to be a woman, trying to escape this patriarchal kind of trap that she sort of found herself in. The score has a remarkable like very haunting motif that repeats over and over throughout the film that reminded me a lot of Bird with the Crystal Plumage and
Mm.
yeah, really fantastic one. I think this was the favorite of the Martino movies that I watched, which there are a lot of Martino movies on this list. I mean,
Yeah.
he was very prolific at the time. Um,
This is one I want to watch. I
yes.
saw the other Martino films on this list, but this
hmm
is the one I've missed.
I'm trying to think of where I think I found it on Tubi,
Okay.
for which is a free service. I'm sure it's available in the UK, right? Is Tubi over there?
I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. 2B is yeah.
Yeah, this was a really good, like just solid, surprising one. I think just really the highlight is her performance and how her paranoia spirals out by the end. There's a kind of shocking twist reveal at the end too. That's really good. Then in 1971, I also watched a film called The Night Evelyn Came Out of the Grave. Another great
Oh, that
title.
title. Yeah.
Yeah, this one primarily focuses on a male point of view, which I've found like I don't know a bit more of a chore to watch, I think, than a lot of the other movies. It's about a
Mm.
rich, mentally unstable man with a penchant for S&M games, particularly with women who remind him of his former wife. This sparks a chain of bizarre events after he gets remarried. There's a lot of things to recommend as far as the craft level on this film. Gorgeous photography.
Mm.
There are two particular sequences. One that opens the film of this guy running, and behind him you see sort of people chasing after him, but they've used some kind of strange lens or some kind of strange filter on the lens of the camera that distorts and kind of warps the bodies in the background in a really interesting way. And then there's a gorgeous slow-mo sequence of a naked woman running through a flowery field that feels very like a bit of a departure from the usual kind of dream sequences you see in these movies.
Yeah.
The score is also extremely inventive, although it's kind of all over the place. It sort of shifts genre to genre
Mm.
very quickly in a whiplash fashion. Definitely worth watching. I don't think it's one that I am eager to revisit anytime soon, though.
Mm.
And then we have a pair of Martino movies next in 1972. All the Colors of the Dark and Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. Probably
Okay.
the lo
Yeah, it's a great title.
Yeah, it's probably the longest sort of mouthful, I think. Did you see either of those films?
So I saw last night. I was watching All Colors of the Dark, and
hmm
it's not. I wasn't engaging with it, and I think partly I was a bit annoyed
hmm
that the protagonist, this woman who suffered a great trauma of losing her baby in a car crash. I think I understand the significance of that trauma impacting her psychologically, but I'm also a little bothered by how the film just defines her by that trauma alone,
hmm
because she feels like quite an empty space in every other situation. It's quite visually imaginative and steers a bit further away from the conventions of Giallo in that we expect a serial killer, a string of murders from their perspective. And this one kind of plays it a bit more. Not to say other Giallo films don't have the element of the psychological, but this one, she's suffering a lot with her own hallucinations and
hmm
I suppose her own instability, and a lot of that was quite visually engaging, but gradually I kind of felt it wore thin after a while too.
Right.
It was like, okay, I get it. It sort of felt like it was bogging down what could have been space more to develop her as a character. But
hmm
maybe I'm also just being nitpicky. I think maybe if I was watching it in quite a groggy mood, I'm probably not going to be the most kind towards it.
Yeah, well, but I think you raise an interesting point there, though, which is, I think, a very valid and chief criticism of this entire genre is that many of the
Mm,
characters feel very one note and
mm,
underwritten. Especially the victims sort of fall into the same kind of tropes over and over again. And this is not to say that these filmmakers weren't trying to say something or comment on society in any way, but a lot of these films essentially were made for pure entertainment purposes. A lot of them, I think, don't really amount to much outside of this kind of sensationalism, sexploitation, very just like energetic, erotic genre fare, that people are just interested in experiencing on a pure entertainment value. And then, we have the ones that kind of rise above that. There are a few, well, more than a few examples
Mm.
that sort of attempt to really aim for something more. So there's another run of 1972 films, Smile Before Death, which I attempted to watch, and I just found it rather boring and uninteresting. I think it took like 30 minutes to get to the first kill, which to me is,
Oh,
if you're gonna make one of these movies, you have to start out with something
yeah,
exciting.
yeah.
And then there's the Red Queen kills 7 times from Miraglia. That was one that I do want to see soon. The Weapon, the Hour, the Motive, and then Don't Torture a Duckling from Fulci, which
I've
I
heard that one's
also,
very good.
yes, it's very highly recommended. And I think it's regarded as one of his better movies.
Mm. I
I sadly didn't get to any of his films on this list.
The only one I remember, which I didn't rewatch it for this, I saw it years ago, was the New York Ripper,
Hmm.
which I remember being pretty shocking even by today's standards.
Hmm.
Like some of the kills, this was, I think I saw it like 10 years ago, and some of the kills have still kind of stuck with me, like
Hmm.
one specifically with a glass bottle. It's
Hmm.
like, that's a vicious film.
Yeah, I think that's primarily what Lucio Fulci is known for is kind
Mm.
of his extreme intensity with the violence in his films.
Even zombie flesh eaters,
Hmm.
like there's a scene with an eye that's about to be poked
Hmm.
with I think it's a bit of a broken door or something. And it's just, oh, some of these, I mean, that's quite a silly film as well because there's a zombie that wrestles a shark, but
Yes.
but there's some of the more grislier moments, they do really stick with you.
Yeah, he seems to be able to balance like, the macabre with humor pretty well. So next is Torso in
Mm,
1973 from Sergio Martino.
I liked this one.
I did too. I think this is a very interesting movie. It's about a group of female students who are terrorized by a masked killer. Hoping to get away from the carnage, they flee to the countryside, only to be followed by the killer, where he increases his body count. This is one of the major ones that I think really plays up the psychosexual element of
Yes.
not only the murders, but I feel like in many of these movies you don't exactly get a view inside the killer's mind,
Mm,
except for maybe a few things. I think this is one of the few movies that really sort of actually tries to explore their
yeah.
psychology.
Yeah,
Um,
the hints at a traumatic background,
yes.
and it's a nasty one as well. Actually, like it's
Hmm.
not only does it work as like a solid motivator and understanding that this killer is a chauvinistic piece of work, but it's the way the film kind of threads each kill in relation to either a woman's sexuality
Hmm.
or her refusal to give consent using the violence as a weapon against her. It's like there's this sense of that motivation. It makes sense because I want to explain killer's motivation, but I also know it's a key spoiler, so I'll try not to. But the way it does it is like you realize, yes, he would be frustrated that these women are off having sex
Hmm.
or are refusing men in having sex, and
Hmm.
the way the film frames it in that it could be any man who's been refused sex
Yes.
who could be a killer. It's quite frightening. It kind of makes me think of again the girl who knew too much a bit, where the concern of women is the focus here,
Hmm.
where how many women, cis or trans, have had to deal with blokes who don't know when to accept no as an answer.
Right.
It was quite a frightening angle to have, even though I also think the film kind of falls into its own male gaze trap a
Oh,
bit because
absolutely.
it's
Yes.
it's it's a very horny film.
Yes,
It's
incredibly
it's
so.
it's very horny to watch these women die. It's like the
Yeah.
women they die, but their breasts are exposed,
Hmm.
or we see two women making out for a very long period of time, and it's
Yes.
like,
Yes.
okay, I get it. It's for titillation, I get it.
Right.
It's
Right.
but I really liked the angle that it had about this sort of sexually frustrated violence being taken out on women who probably have to deal with people who can't accept the answer no.
Hmm. Yes, to me it anticipates very quickly actually the sort of early slasher movies. I was thinking especially of Black Christmas, which happens just 1 year after this.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of similar DNA in that
Mm.
movie. And yeah, just the imagery that they use of that they keep going back to of the broken little doll, the dismembered little
Yes.
doll. And the fact that, I mean, you touched on it, but all of these men presented in the story, I love how the film treats them because they are like they're losers and they're idiots
Mm.
and they just
one
they're
one man in particular, they keep framing him as like this guy could be the killer, and it's like
uh-huh.
he's really vulgar and violent, and it's like if you've watched enough of these films you realize he's not the killer. That's too obvious, but we should
Hmm.
be concerned about him around the other women.
Yeah, but then yeah, and of course there are those just really long sequences of half-naked women dancing together and
Mm,
stuff. I mentioned in my Letterboxd review that it's trying to have its cake and eat it too, I
yes,
think.
that's a good way of putting it.
I think with that film. But yeah, one that I liked quite a bit.
Yeah.
And then 74, a movie I watched called What Have They Done to Your Daughters? I was pretty impressed by this one. So the setup of this is a little complicated. About a young girl she's found hanged due to an anonymous tip. Soon after this, a peeping Tom is caught with photos of her having sex with a local teenage dropout. An investigation begins, and it focuses on the girl's parents, as it is revealed that the girl's mother hired a private eye to investigate her activities. This unspools a larger conspiracy with a leather-clad motorcycle killer at its center. So, this film is really much more of a kind of traditional police thriller than a Giallo. It contains many, many elements of Giallo, but I think it's really primarily focused on the investigation itself and the things that the lead investigator, an actor whose name is escaping me at the moment, but he's very good and he seems sort of like if you're thinking about Charles Bronson and Death Wish at this time, I think
Mm,
this guy in this movie would be a sort of similar analog. And this is one of those. I'm going to attempt to pronounce this word, but polizioteschi is sort of the Italian kind of police crime drama subgenre, which has a lot of overlap with these Giallo movies. It's remarkable in that the central conflict and the central conceit of this movie being a child sex trafficking ring is very
mm,
dark. It's very bleak, and it even opens and ends with a sort of quote that says something like every day unexplained violent acts happen without anyone's knowledge or so. It opens in this very vague kind of you're about to witness, something that may never be solved.
yeah.
It's very very dark in its content, but I think it's also pretty from a technical craft as well. There's a chase sequence once the police have identified the motorcycle killer. There's a really great, very kinetic chase sequence in the middle of the movie that I liked quite a bit.
This one sounds
Um,
great. I'll have to search this one
yes,
up.
it's I think it's another one that is included in the Arrow Giallo Essentials.